All right. Good morning, Art. How is it going?
It's going. I'm excited about that music. It actually made the blood start pumping before this one.
Yeah, no, I was actually having a dance party over here before I took the
Yeah.
camera. A little embarrassed to do it on camera, but nice
Next
addition.
time.
Nice, yes, nice addition, Bill Bowman. Thank you for that. So we're here today for our monthly webinar, how to identify vulnerabilities in patch systems. Real quick, Bill, head back to that opening slide. So I had to get a little bit of an education from my marketing team on the new addition to our opening slide. And I called this, I was asking what's up with the rodent, but it turns out that is a capybara, which I haven't looked, but it might be a rodent, might not sure. Art, what do you think?
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's rodent. Yeah, it looks
Rodent.
like a guinea pig to me. Yeah.
All right. Well, in the chat before we get started, or throughout this, is if anyone knows why this capybara is all the rage on the internet, please feel free to drop a chat. And if you don't know, don't feel bad. I had no idea um, why this was cool all of a sudden. But someone on my marketing team educated me, and I feel a little bit more hip. So, all right, let's get started, Bill. So yes, as we mentioned, we're going to have this webinar this month. It's how to identify vulnerabilities in patch systems. My name's Steve Brown. I'm the VP of Sales here at Arium, and I'm here with Art O'Kane. He's our field CISO, CIO, resident expert in all things, but in particular, cybersecurity, IT management, and happy to be here with you, Art.
Thanks.
All right, so before we jump into the meat of this, we'll just quickly run through a little bit about Arium. So Arium is, an IT management company, cybersecurity platform, and we are here to help businesses create value through resilience. Resilience comes in many forms. Our first and most important focus is on IT and cybersecurity resilience, but that extends beyond throughout the rest of the business. We were born from 5 amazing companies, and we now have a national footprint that has us helping businesses all over the country. One of our areas of expertise is ransomware incident response. So we are out there on the front lines responding to ransomware events every day. We're actively engaged at full capacity, and at the moment, as we spin down a job, we are picking another one back up. We're having to say no to jobs because there is a lot of ransomware activity at the moment. Last year, we saw a dip in activity, and from about December through present, it is back to record high volume. So we're fully engaged, but we're using this information to help inform the protection that we provide to our clients, that we help to mitigate and reduce the risk of a ransomware incident. The clients that we're responding to are not the clients that we're supporting from an IT and cybersecurity perspective on a proactive basis. So we have a really nice customer list ranging from Fortune 500 companies down to regional small businesses. So we work with a wide range of clients on a number of fronts, from IT management, cybersecurity, and digital transformation. And as I mentioned, we have a national footprint. We have offices in central Pennsylvania, 2 offices in Maryland, Houston, and Milwaukee. And then we also have a distributed workforce that lives throughout the United States. I personally am in Albuquerque, New Mexico. All right, so the agenda for today, we're going to talk first about how vulnerabilities arise. Second, the danger of 0 days and ways to get alerted. Fourth, applying the patch. And fifth, going from reactive to ongoing and proactive. All right. So from here, I'm going to hand off to Art and let you run us through our agenda.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. So, like Steve mentioned, we're engaged heavily in incident response. And one of the things that's very important for us is that feedback loop between our ransomware response and our IT team. Now, one of the things that we've learned doing incident response is that although most breaches actually start with a phishing attempt, where they're stealing creds, phishing, once the attacker gains any kind of foothold, the way they're getting around your network is exploiting vulnerabilities. And the way that they're accessing resources is exploiting vulnerabilities. So if you have an unpatched system, it becomes a way that the attacker can grab a foothold. So as far as how vulnerabilities arise, there's a lot to it, but everything from misconfiguration to coding mistakes. But when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about more than just your PC. We're talking about more than just your server. We're talking about all your cloud resources, your network resources, etc. But let's take a quick poll here. How many different software programs are employed in your IT environment? And the reason for this poll is really to see where you are as far as understanding how many things on your network can be vulnerable.
Software programs for me, I mean, I primarily operate on Chrome as web apps are very common for me, but I have maybe 6 to 10, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chrome has vulnerabilities very frequently where they're always pushing updates. So that is one that is important to stay on top of. Most browsers, Firefox is the same. Great. So we got a really good, dispersal of results here. It's almost a normalized curve, but 11 to 15 is kind of low. Yeah, good results. All right. So where do these vulnerabilities come from? In software development is where most of them are introduced. People are trying to write code quickly. And even when you're putting in your best efforts of testing and doing QA and pen testing and making sure that everything is done right, vulnerabilities are added by accident into the code. It may be something that's acceptable as best practice today and becomes a vulnerability later. It may be a mistake. It may be a misconfiguration, but no software is perfect. And despite everybody's best efforts, there's no such thing as software that's coming out perfect and never has to be patched. A lot of times software is just forgotten about and replaced. But when a security researcher or an attacker is digging into a piece of software, they're almost always able to find a vulnerability in it. So I've already started on this concept, but there's not a vulnerability until it's discovered. It's the tree falling in the woods. It's usually discovered by researchers, by users, by bug bounty programs. Bug bounties are something that really large companies use where they pay people to try to attack them. They say, hey, see if you can find a vulnerability in our system. If you can, we'll pay you for this. Vulnerabilities are found by the users too. Users will stumble across a problem in the software and will find, the bug and report them to the company. Internal testing, pen testing, QA, etc. That's a way to find bugs, but often vulnerabilities are found by threat actors. It's these people that are constantly looking at ways to get into the system, and they're motivated to find a way. So sometimes we don't know that there's a vulnerability in our system, but the hacker does. So I think we can already kind of think about what the dangers of unpatched vulnerabilities are. I mentioned, initially that it's really how the attacker gets a foothold in your system. If you're fully secure and fully patched, it's hard for them to get around. So here's a poll question for you. When do you patch your software?
I'm a happy patcher. I patch away. I patch freely. I see a patch, I patch it. But
Yep.
this is in particular on my phone. I get those updates, notifications. Oh man, I patch away. I'm kind of reckless with it potentially.
Absolutely, me too. I deploy patches personally without testing them. It's patch on my phone, patch on my computer, go. I don't want to be found unpatched, so it's something I'm constantly pushing the next patch. But I do know people that don't patch at all, that their computer is telling them that they need to update, and they're telling the computer, don't bother me. Same thing with the phone. They may have a phone update that they don't update for months.
Yes, I know someone like that. My wife is a never patcher.
Yep. It's all fun and games until that thing that the patch was for is actually used against you.
Yeah, my family we're all iPhone users, including siblings and parents. So I'm the one that's sending the notification. There's a new 0 day. Everyone update.
Yeah, maybe you should have a party at the kitchen table and just have everybody whip out their phones and update together.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty fun.
Awesome. All right, let's move along. So this is really interesting, and it may be hard to grasp if you are looking at it and are like, what does any of this mean? Well, number one, there's a difference between a vulnerability and an exploit. A vulnerability, like I said, is a bug, a misconfiguration. It's something that can be used potentially as a weakness in your system to gain access to data, access to your network, access to something. It can be used not only just to access, but to take down your system. So sometimes an attacker can't get access to your environment, but they can use that vulnerability to crash your system. So that's still a vulnerability, even though they're not able to access any data. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that are discovered constantly, and it could be in your firewall, it could be in a switch or access point, it could be in your phone, it could be in an application like Microsoft Word, it could be in anything that you use. So people that are researching and discovering these vulnerabilities are usually kind of tracking what those vulnerabilities are. The next step is really discovering an exploit for that vulnerability. That's really when it becomes a problem. So a vulnerability, you can identify, hey, there's this problem or this bug with this software, but we don't know how to use it. Like we notice it's a problem, but there's no proof of concept yet of how to use it to gain access to a network. Once a researcher or a hacker develops a proof of concept, then it becomes an exploitable vulnerability. So there's an actual way to use this vulnerability against you. So you may see a thing about a vulnerability in this Fortinet firewall. That's something that Fortinet will probably release a patch for. And like this is a cycle that happens constantly. But when someone releases a exploit for it, then it becomes a real problem, because then there's a way into that device that's been published, the how-to guide of how to get into that environment. So I use a Fortinet as an example. It could be anything. It could be any application you have. So when that's discovered by the vendor, And there may be a huge lag time that if it was discovered by a hacker, they may never tell the vendor about the vulnerability. They may never tell the vendor about the exploit. But a researcher usually will. A researcher that discovers a vulnerability will usually contact the vendor and say, hey, I've exploited your vulnerability this way. And then the vulnerability will be fixed by the vendor. And that's usually when the vendor will release a notice and say, hey, there's this vulnerability, you'll see a CVE, here's the patch for it, here's the workaround, or here's what to avoid, that kind of thing. But there's a huge lag time here. That vulnerability may have been discovered years before a patch was released. And so usually when we're finding out about it, it's actually already existed for a while. They're trying to reduce that. Researchers obviously are helping. Testing's obviously helping. But the closer that we can get to patching your system as soon as a patch is released, the less time an exploit is in the wild that can be used against your system. So usually once that exploit's released is when there's a field day all of a sudden. It's, okay, now everybody can attack me now. So what do I have to do until there's a patch? There's in that window, you're really highly vulnerable as an organization because there's an exploit that's unpatched. So during that window, anything can happen. The attacker can drop ransomware, other malware, can exfiltrate data, steal data, breach data, can intercept communications, phish, do other fraud. Really, the sky's the limit in between that exploit is identified and you are patched time window. And there are sites like shodan.io that'll show machines out there that have been discovered to be vulnerable and that are unpatched. And attackers can leverage sites like that to find, where their next attack target is going to be. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to stay on top of patching. Now, patching is one of the most operationally difficult things that IT will do. We manage workstations and servers all the time, manage networks all the time. We're doing a great job on server migrations and managing users, but patching has a risk associated with it. Patching could bring down your environment if it's done wrong. Patching often means rebooting a device or a server. And what if that server or that device doesn't come back up? What if the patch is bad? So there are all these risks associated with patching, but it's our belief that not patching is leaving the door wide open for an attack like this, like ransomware, like data breaches, like engaging in phishing, etc. And one of the things to be considering in all of this is that there's more than just your environment and things you control. There's your whole supply chain, which can be adding risk to you. So any software vendor, service provider, etc., can be a part of your supply chain risk. In addition, any software that you buy, that can have other supply chain risks associated with it. And everybody's heard of the Log4j incident that happened really last year, that there was this bug and in a vulnerability identified in Log4j, and suddenly it was in the news everywhere. Everything's vulnerable because Log4j is a Java package that was released by Apache, and it was used in most applications. Developers would use the Log4j package because it was a great logging plugin. So anything from firewalls to access points to applications to servers, everything was using Log4j. And did any of us go and install Log4j on purpose on our network? No. It's just inherent in our supply chain. All of these things that we bought are now vulnerable because of some other module that those vendors used in their software. So things like Log4j can happen anytime. In the year previous, there were SolarWinds, Orion, there were Kaseya breaches, Microsoft was breached, FireEye was breached, all these large companies that really indicate that there's a supply chain vulnerability to all of us. So as you're developing your IT strategy and your security strategy nowadays, this is something that we always used to just kind of ignore, and we just assumed the vendor's taking care of it. They're releasing something that they're going to manage and patch and take care of. But the risk is really on you as an organization to manage your supply chain and all of your vendors and partners, and identify the risk that is inherent with them. And that risk of vulnerabilities is real. So how do you manage all this? How do you manage your patches? How do you manage your vulnerabilities? Well, there's a lot of ways, but one thing that we recommend everybody do is get on a patching schedule and get notified about vulnerabilities and patches. Now, this is something that is usually appointed to someone like your IT service provider, your security service provider. This is something that your internal IT or your internal security team may do. It probably is something that's overwhelming if you're a small business and you're just going to try to solo it. And it's probably something that is going to fill up your mailbox with stuff that doesn't make sense to you if you're not an IT person. But that kind of email notification and Twitter feeds, Reddit, etc., is how people find out about these vulnerabilities. Like recently was the 3CX vulnerability last week that was identified by CrowdStrike, and that was in a phone system. And some of you may have that phone system that you're using, and they're really saying that anyone who's using that phone system needs to do an incident response now because of that vulnerability. So how did we find out about that? Because of Reddit and Twitter and emails notifying us about this vulnerability. So that notification is important. So it comes from the software provider. It'll come from security companies. It'll come from in-app notifications. You'll see a notification saying, hey, you need to patch this app. You'll see it a lot with like your banking app saying, okay, you need to patch before you can use this. Software companies' PR and website notifications, will say, hey, that these patches are going to be released here. Microsoft is common with Patch Tuesday. Everybody's aware of Patch Tuesday that is managing a Microsoft solution. Microsoft usually releases all of their updates at the same time, unless it's something that's really critical and needs to be addressed ahead of time. And they'll release notification of all their patches and what it's addressing and what vulnerabilities they're addressing. And I get the same kind of emails from Cisco, where we get a notification from Cisco saying, if you have this model of this ASA with this software, it needs to be patched. So it's important to get on top of those notifications so you can be aware of what's happening. One way to manage it in a kind of more organized way is to compare your environment against a third-party database, like a MITRE or NIST database. And that's usually using like a vulnerability scanning tool. And again, this is something that you need an IT professional to do, using a tool like Nessus or OpenVAS or something like that, or something that is like our continuous pen testing solution, where it can check your automatically check your environment for exploitable vulnerabilities. Things like that are extremely useful to stay organized and really identify what you have in comparison to what's out there, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities that are being released constantly. How do you know what actually applies to your environment? Those vulnerability scanning tools will scan your environment and let you know hey, your firewall has these vulnerabilities, your server has these vulnerabilities, your workstations have these vulnerabilities. So that's really how to stay organized about this. And relying on a partner. If you don't have internal IT or security team managing vulnerabilities for you, then asking your managed service provider or your managed security service provider to manage your vulnerabilities is really the next step. So vulnerability management is not just identifying those vulnerabilities, but also patching it. So a lot of MSSPs will just identify your vulnerabilities and let you know that you need to patch those. That's where it can be difficult, because then you're still getting a list of vulnerabilities that you need to patch, and you may not know how to patch them, or it may be operationally difficult or risky for you to patch them alone. So, having a trusted partner to handle that can be important if you don't have an internal IT managing that for you.
Yeah, Art, real quick, you touched on one thing that I want to bring some attention to, because I know I look at a vulnerability scan of a business, and there could be thousands of vulnerabilities, tens of thousands in some cases of vulnerabilities. I see a dashboard like that and I get overwhelmed and like, where do you even begin? So one of the things you keyed it out on is exploitable vulnerabilities. And sometimes it's the combination of individual vulnerabilities that allows you to get to an exploit.
Yes.
And that's where something like a penetration test will be able to connect the dots for you and show you, okay, well, here's the most critical vulnerabilities that you really should be patching, versus where do you start with a list of 1,000 or even 100, and how do I get those remediated, which could be very overwhelming.
Absolutely. So those vulnerability scanners will rank vulnerabilities for you based off of CVSS scoring. So basically like industry scoring of those vulnerabilities. And that can be helpful if that's what you're using as your tool to, identify what you need to patch first. And I would definitely prioritize vulnerabilities, because you don't want to worry about little nitty-gritty vulnerabilities if you have big gaping holes in your network. But those an automated pen testing solution that is actually trying to exploit those vulnerabilities, that'll give you a different look. That'll say, okay, out of all these vulnerabilities, these 5 are actually the ones that a hacker would use to get into your network. So let's address these 5. We're, ignoring the CVSS scoring. This may be important according to Nessus in the industry and OpenVAS, but if you are not actually able to use it to hack your network, then it's not really that big a deal. So yeah, those pen testing solutions are the way to really identify what the most important things for you to tackle are. Oh man, how to patch. Again, I said it's risky. It can be tricky. So
just hit update like I do on my phone.
Yeah. So workstations, that's how I would do it. Why? Because usually there's little operational risk to a workstation. Hopefully you're keeping your files in the cloud or on a server or somewhere that is more protected than your workstation. So usually workstations, we just adopt a fire and forget patching policy. So in our system, we patch daily. So anything that hits the system, whether it's a Chrome, Firefox, Java, Adobe Reader, WinZip, LogMeIn, whatever tools you have, daily, we try to update those on workstations. A lot of those require a reboot. So if you never reboot your workstation, then, those patches just may be queued up for next time you reboot. But the way we treat workstations is kind of how I'd recommend any company to treat workstations is treat them like cattle. You want to patch them constantly. And if there's a problem, you reinstall it. They're not, a huge operational risk. If you install a bad patch and somebody's complaining about their computer not working, you reinstall your computer. Usually you're not losing any data that way because you're keeping your data on the server, you're keeping your data in the cloud. The rest of your environment is where it gets risky. So auditing your IT environment and really identifying what assets you have and identifying where your patches are needed is really important. I've mentioned firewalls several times. There's switches, routers, access points, other applications, your servers themselves, your storage devices, your backup storage. There's a lot of things on your network. And even beyond that, there's operational technology and IoT. Those thermostats on the wall, your DVR, your HVAC system, which may not even be managed by you. It may be you have an HVAC vendor that comes and plugs in the system and you're just trusting them to manage it. So auditing that environment and determining what needs to be managed is key. So, we can manage servers and workstations all day, but if that's really only a third of your IT footprint, then you still may have a lot of vulnerability out there. You may have a lot of devices that nobody's looking at and nobody's managing. Once you've identified that list of devices and what those patches are, and again, those patches can come from like a vulnerability management system or a vulnerability scanning system, download the patch from the vendor. And with Windows, it'll download and install them automatically, but most devices out there won't. Most devices, you actually have to download a patch. So, for your firewall, for your access point, etc. Download the patch. And the next step is the tricky part. Ideally, you want to test that patch on a backed up copy of your production environment. And most of you who are small businesses can't do that because you don't have a dev environment and a production environment. You don't have a test environment. You just have production. You have your small business network. So it's really difficult for you to test a firewall patch before just slapping it on your $10,000 firewall. It's not like you have another one laying around in a lot of cases. Now, those of you who we have set up in high availability, when you have two firewalls, we can run the patch on one. And then if it works, run the patch on the second one. So we don't have to patch both in the same breath so that we can find out if the patch bricks the firewall. But that's the risk. And that is the operational difficulty with patching, is that the ideal way to patch is to take a backup of the device, test the patch, and then if it doesn't work, restore that backup. And if it does work, release it into production. But again, most small businesses can't swing that. So what we depend on is a patch management system. So our patch management system does testing of patches, but not every environment is going to match your exact environment. So even though our patch management system may test a patch and it may look good, when it hits your environment, it may cause a problem with your server. So if there's a problem, we react and restore. And we're following this patch management method, but it's important when you are implementing them on your own to understand that there's a level of operational risk. What happens if you reboot that server and it doesn't come back up? What happens if you reboot that device and it doesn't come back up? So you're having to weigh this risk, but you're also looking at these vulnerabilities and these exploits that are in the wild that can use this vulnerability that's on your device to get into your network. So there is some urgency to patch. So one of the problems that traditional IT people will have is that they'll leave their machines unpatched for forever and just say, okay, it's not worth it. It's not worth rebooting these machines. It's not worth trying to install a patch. What if something goes wrong? We're not going to be able to recover. And I can tell you that most of the ransomware incidents that we're on are those kind of environments. They're environments where a lot of machines haven't been patched. And that's how the attack was so successful. So we're looking at it as risk management here. It's important to mitigate your risk from cyber attack by patching systems, and just understand that there is some operational risk, and so we have to treat patching with some level of care in order to make sure that your systems are backed up, so that we can get you back up and running quickly if there is a bad patch. Now, how often are there bad patches? It's not all the time. Microsoft tends to release, a bad patch, every couple months, but usually it's not detrimental to your system. Usually it causes one thing to be fluky, and then they fix it with the next patch. With other devices where there's heavy, risk of bricking, like your firewall or your phone, they usually test those patches a lot better. Nobody has, you haven't seen an iOS patch where everybody installs their iOS patch on their iPhone and then they have a bricked iPhone. That's not a common occurrence. So I would say, because of that risk being generally kind of low, back up your devices and install your patches. So most patches have steps on how to install them. Some vendors are very clear about, make sure that you do this, make sure that you're turning off these services, make sure that you're putting it into maintenance mode, that kind of thing, before installing the patch. So it's important to follow those steps from the vendor. Sometimes people will just install a patch and fire away and reboot without really looking at what that patch is requiring from you. And there's been some patches where it may be a patch for your Exchange server, but they explicitly will say, don't run this on a DC. Don't run it on a domain controller. And those of you who, are unclear as to what an Exchange servers and domain controller are, I'm sorry that I just did that to you. Sorry for your pain. But there are kinds of servers, and so it's just illustrating that we need to be really careful about what to install them on. And again, this is a reason to bring in an IT guy so that he can deal with it, or she can deal with it, and that it's not something that you're trying to, as a business owner, trying to figure out. And ideally, it's an automated process so that you don't have to worry about it all the time. Next, after patching and everything, monitor the system. This is really important, because if you patch and reboot on a Friday night thinking, okay, I'm gonna patch before the weekend, you may come in on Monday with everything not working. And it's important to consider that Friday night, when you still have the weekend to fix your problem, before coming in on Monday to a bunch of angry coworkers because the system's down. Patch better. Backup. I'm the biggest evangelist of backups in the world. I think that any change you make on a system, you should do a backup first, that kind of thing. But back up your systems and test your patches thoroughly. And this is something that, if you have replicated, duplicated systems, you can do. But if you're a small business and you have one server, again, testing patches can be hard. You may not have any infrastructure, any way to do that. But so backups are crucial. So you back up so that you can patch. When I'm thinking about resilience for your organization, I'm thinking about backups as being a foundational thing that we need to make sure happens on all your systems so that we can recover. You should almost expect to encounter a problem at some point that you will need to recover from with backup. It should just be a rhythm. And if it's a rhythm, then restoring can be a rhythm too. It shouldn't be a panic attack when it's time to restore if you're constantly doing this. Now, what if you can't do this? What if you can't manage backup? It's call an MSP or an MSSP and have them manage it with you. Now, assign responsibilities to the proper people and teams. Document and verify your patches. Why? Why do we want to document and verify our patches? This can be kind of a disaster if you're just willy-nilly firing patches all the time, and something goes wrong. How do you trace back and find out what patch it was? How do you find out, oh, it was this patch that we installed, last Wednesday that is affecting this application that we're seeing a problem with today? If you haven't documented what you've done, then you have no way of tracing it. And then it becomes really hard troubleshooting. And I've been there. I did really hard troubleshooting for years of chasing my tail without really any documentation of what happened. And it's really hard to find a root cause for a problem when you're not documenting and verifying. Now, make a cadence. I'd mentioned that Friday night thing. That's probably a good window if you have a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 company. Just prepare to on Friday, fire off your patches and verify that everything came back up. Get into a cadence of it, make it a rhythm. And like I mentioned before with the pen testing and the vulnerability analysis, is think about the risk. Think about the risk operationally to you and the risk of cyber attack, and really what the priorities are. What systems are the most important for you to patch? Because patching 1,000 vulnerabilities across your network may be impossible. So every network's going to have some old stuff. Every network's going to have some old printer that has some vulnerability that you can't do anything about. So there's some risk acceptance that you have to do when you're considering your vulnerabilities, but patching what you can and what actually will make an impact is important. So let's think about, what can we do to reduce your risk of cyber attack or of an effective cyber attack? And what can we do to have the biggest impact on the operation of your company? And if we think about what those are, it's, backups, it's managed detection and response, it's patching, it's multi-factor authentication. And, patching is a key part of this, but it's a part of a system. Patching alone is not going to make you secure. You need backups to get back. You need multi-factor authentication to be able to protect your identities. You need that managed detection and response to see and stop an attack when it's happening. End of life software, and almost all of you have this. So I applaud any of you who are really staying on top of it. It's hard. It's hard because as a business, you want an investment to last a long time, don't you? You want to, when you spend $10,000 on a server or $20,000 on a server, you expect it to last. However, there are constantly changes in software, and they're making it end of life, which means that they're not supporting it anymore. They're not patching it, and there's no upgrades available for it anymore. So what that means is if you have an end of life product, it's hackable. Any new exploit or vulnerability that's been made for that product, you can do nothing to defend yourself against it. So you're wide open on those products. Yet many of you are probably still running some of this, Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2, Windows 7. Those are common in almost every environment that I see, because there's some kind of system that you can't move off of, or there's some system that you've invested a lot of money in that you want to run until the wheels fall off. And you just need to understand that if you're not updating, and if you're not replacing that gear, if you're not replacing that server, now that's a huge cyber risk. That's a huge vulnerability to your network. So you have to weigh that risk. But I understand that there's a business case to running your old legacy stuff, especially if there's software that's not made anymore, has to run on this old stuff. There's other security we can put in place if that's your position. But you have to understand that there's nothing we can do about protecting that device once the attacker's in it, because it's unpatchable. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, it was a lot of good information. So patching, vulnerabilities, something that we can't look past, can't avoid, have to have a strategy for it, got to prioritize it. So we just
Luckily, it's something that our team does really well. It's something that, being born out of managed services on the IT side, before getting into cybersecurity years ago, it's something that we've been doing for a long time. So patching is something that if you need any help, you obviously are partnered with experts that are able to do that. But yeah, it is something that takes a strategy and takes some thinking and some identification and some risk management around.
So we got a couple of questions from Vivian here. So she asks, how can businesses ensure that their IT patching efforts are compliant with relevant regulations and standards?
Interesting. So different compliances that require certain things. One of the common ones is, almost every compliance standard I've seen will say, we'll ask, do you have any end of life, hardware or software on your network? Basically, they're understanding that your biggest source of vulnerability is usually that end of life gear, and that they won't really, you aren't compliant on that machine if you have end of life gear. That being said, as far as patching goes, most compliance standards are saying that you need to patch as soon as on high and critical security patches as soon as they're available. So that means that regulation and compliance standards are usually expecting you to patch immediately, when there's a higher critical vulnerability or exploit.
All right, here's another one. How can IT patching be automated to save time and reduce errors?
Great. Yeah, there are several patch management solutions out there. Most of them are made for enterprise. So, they're made on the scale of a 30,000 user or 50,000 user company. So they tend to be very expensive packages. So on a small scale, there are, really, with Windows workstations and everything, pushing out automated patching and reboot from your server, and basically putting in what we call a group policy to force all your workstations to reboot is the way to really tackle the workstation part of it. But the server portion still needs to be done and managed manually. If you're partnering with a company like us, we have patch management systems. We have those enterprise grade patch management systems that allow us to make sure you're backed up and patch your systems effectively, and monitor and verify that they came up okay afterwards. But if you're doing it as a small business without a partner, it's usually, besides workstations, the rest of it's a manual effort. It's identifying what your patches are, downloading them, installing them manually, verifying they come back up.
All right. Any other? Let's see what else we got. Looks like we got one more. How can machine learning and artificial intelligence be used to improve IT patching and cybersecurity? Wow, that's a
wow. Okay. All right. That's okay. That's my next company idea right there. Thank you, Vivian. I'll have to send you a royalty of some kind. But yeah, that's using AI to identify really what the patching needs to be is really something like our continuous pen testing solution does. It identifies, using AI, what the route that the attacker would take through your network, and therefore which vulnerabilities are important to patch. However, patching using AI and, identifying the risk behind those patches using AI, I think is something that hasn't been done yet. So I think there's definitely some opportunity in the market to identify, okay, what are the risks behind these patches, and do kind of a risk scoring, and and installing the patches and managing that completely using AI and machine learning. It would be awesome. But right now we're using machine learning and AI on the attack perspective. So we have automated attack tests that we can do on an environment to see really what needs to be patched most urgently. And we can do that for any of our customers.
Great. So what's next to come? We have a couple more webinars that are coming up here. So we've run through a couple of these. Next one up we have is have a plan if disaster strikes. So talking about disaster recovery plans, assuming a breach mentality. What is an immutable backup? Why do I need one? And then how do I practice? How do we make sure that this plan actually is going to work if something does happen? That one's scheduled for May 10th.
Awesome.
After that, we've got actively monitor threats. Why mean time to detect matters? What are all these acronyms that I see and hear? We don't even have one of the most popular ones on there at the moment, which is XDR, but you got XDR,
Yep.
MDR, EDR, SIM, MSSP, SOC, and then AirGuard, which is Arium's approach to providing this active monitoring and reduction of the threat profile out there. Looks like we've got that one scheduled for June 14th. We hope that everyone can join.
Those two are amazing. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I know DR planning, immutable backup, something you're passionate about. So
yes,
that's definitely a good one for people to join.
Absolutely. So, and tabletops, I'm a passionate tabletop, scenario builder. It's kind of the nerd dungeon master in me, but that kind of concept of running through with your corporate team, with your executives, with your IT, with your vendors, what an attack looks like. I can't wait to go through that one with you guys.
Absolutely. Well, great. Thank you so much, Art, for all the knowledge share. And thank you for everyone that was able to join us today. We will follow up with a recording of this and some additional information. And if anyone's got any questions or want to have a conversation about patch management or any other IT or cybersecurity related topic, feel free to reach out to Arium. You can reach out to myself or Art directly, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful April. We look forward to seeing you in May.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.